Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting shortly.
At URI's Harrington School of Communication and Media, every day is an exploration.
With global learning opportunities
and high-profile internships.
Harrington prepares us to be critical media consumers
and creative media producers
in the rapidly changing 21st century marketplace.
In strategic communications.
In multimedia journalism.
In sports media.
In writing and rhetoric.
In information analytics.
In digital media, film, and TV.
Our tight-knit learning community is tailored to build a solid foundation
for powerful creative communication and a lifetime of achievement and opportunity.
Wherever our passions lead. Discovery, opportunity, impact.
The Harrington School of Communication and Media at the University of Rhode Island.
Visit today.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Amina Kothari, Director of the Harrington School of Communication and Media. Welcome to the first lecture sponsored by Harrington School of Communication and Media in collaboration with the College of Arts and Sciences this semester. I'm excited to welcome tonight's speaker, Clint Smith, who will be talking about his book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. It is my pleasure to now pass the virtual mic over to Professor Catherine John, the new Department Chair of Africana Studies, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. John has a doctorate in literature with an emphasis on African diaspora, literary and cultural studies. Her research addresses philosophical issues relevant to the folk culture in African American and African Caribbean context. Take it away, Dr. Catherine John.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I wanted to introduce our guest for today. Clint Smith is the author of the narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. This book achieved #1 status on the New York Times bestseller list. Clint's achievements generally are multifaceted. He taught high school English in Prince George's County, Maryland, where in 2013, he was named the Christine D. Sarbanes Teacher of the Year by the Maryland Humanities Council. In 2014, he was the National Poetry Slam champion, and his poetry collection, Counting Descent, won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. His essays, poems, and scholarly writing have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The New Republic, The Paris Review, and the Harvard Educational Review, to name a few. He has received fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the Art for Justice Fund, the National Science Foundation, and the prestigious Cave Canem Retreat for African American Poets. His 2 TED Talks, The Danger of Silence and How to Raise a Black Son in America, have been collectively viewed more than 9 million times. Clint Smith is currently a staff writer at The Atlantic, and he also teaches writing and literature in the DC Central Detention Facility. He is the host of the YouTube series Crash Course, Black American History. Clint was born and raised in New Orleans. He received his BA in English from Davidson College and his PhD in education from Harvard University. He currently lives in Maryland with his wife and their 2 children. So please put your digital Zoom clapping hands together and join me in welcoming scholar, journalist, writer, and poet Clint Smith to URI.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I only wish that I could be there with you all in person. I know that we are, it's hard to say where we are in this. A couple months ago, I'd have said toward the end of this. Now it's kind of toward the end of this-ish. We hope, but I hope to be doing more in-person events soon. This is also the part of the event where I say that I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, which is in part, who are unvaccinated, and that is in part why I'm still doing virtual events, but also it means that they are home. And it means that at any point in our discussion and conversation, we could be interrupted by somebody asking for more Ritz crackers or wanting to tell poop jokes, which is the sort of developmental stage where we are at the moment. So I, in advance, in case that happens, appreciate everybody's understanding. So I'm here to talk a little bit about my book, which is entitled How the Word is Passed. As was mentioned, has been out for about 4 months now. Came out at the beginning of June. And what I want to do is kind of just walk you through the book and how the book came to be, and sort of talk a little bit about some of the different sites that I've visited for the book before we hop into your questions, which I'm really looking forward to. So I should say that, to begin, this book, the origin story of this book is that in May 2017, I was watching the Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues to P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down here from my home here in Maryland, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street named after someone who owned 150 enslaved people. And we know that symbols and names of iconography are not just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it is to say that all of these things are part of an ecosystem of stories and ideas that help us understand how history has shaped our country and how history has shaped, and particularly oppression and harm and state-sponsored harm, has shaped different communities in specific and idiosyncratic ways over the course of American history. And so what happens is when you better understand that, then you are better able to offer and make amends for some of the harm that has been done over the course of generations in order to build a more equitable society, and in order to examine the landscape of contemporary inequality and to understand that it emerges from this historical context, which too often our young people and our students are not taught about. And I include myself in that. So much of this book emerges from a desire to fill in the gaps of my own childhood, gaps in my own education, and gaps in my own understanding, trying to understand why I lived in a city where there were hundreds of statues and street names and buildings named after people who wanted to keep my ancestors enslaved. And so I was thinking about this in a sort of local context in New Orleans, and then sort of broadened it out and began thinking about this in a national context. How do different places across the country reckon with or fail to reckon with their respective relationships to the history of American slavery? And so I started traveling to different places, dozens of places, 9 of which ended up in the book. And one of the places that I started, and one of the places, and the place that is the first chapter of the book, is Monticello Plantation. Monticello, many will be familiar as the plantation where Thomas Jefferson lived. Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States, one of America's founding fathers. And I wanted to go there because in some ways I think that Jefferson sort of personifies the cognitive dissonance and the hypocrisy and the contradictions of the American project, in the sense that America is a place that's provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities to millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. And we have to hold both of those realities at once in a recognition that both of those things not only exist alongside one another, but are entangled within each other. And Jefferson, again, I think personifies that because he is someone who wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. He is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. And part of what I'm interested is when I go to a place like Monticello, to what extent is that institution having an honest conversation about who Jefferson was, what his legacy was, and how we cannot understand Jefferson without understanding Jefferson as an enslaver. And also, when we go to Monticello, are we telling a full and honest story about that place? Are we telling a story that is grounded in a story that is not singularly centered on Jefferson and his family, but also in the stories and the lives of the enslaved people who lived in Monticello alongside him? The Hemmingses, the Grangers, the Fawcett's. Because in many ways, Monticello belongs to them more than it belongs to Jefferson himself. And so, part of what I think is important for what I wanted the book to open with was an exploration of how one of our founders, in the home of one of our founders, was in many ways serves as an entry point to thinking about history. Because I get emails all the time now from people who visited Monticello 15, 20, 25 years ago. And they always tell me that the way that the Monticello they visited was very different than the Monticello I visited. A Monticello that I visited, which had a specific tour focused on slavery, which had an entire exhibition focused on Sally Hemings and the Hemings family and Jefferson's relationship to them. And that was not the story of Monticello several years ago. That was not the story of Monticello a few decades ago, in which nobody mentioned Sally Hemings by name. Nobody talked about Jefferson as an enslaver. It was all talk about Jefferson, the great man. And I think Monticello is a place that recognizes that it has a responsibility to tell a different story and to tell a more honest story about who this person was. Because this is, again, Jefferson is a reflection of the American experiment that he tried to found. Another place that I go is Angola Prison. Angola Prison is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell people is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences on fields of what was once a plantation, many of whom were sentenced as children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States because it was founded with the specific intention of continuing to convict as many Black people as possible, and was only recently overturned. And you have all these folks working on the fields of what was once a plantation for virtually no pay, pennies on the hour. And someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And so part of what I'm exploring when I go to Angola are what are the ways that a history of white supremacy not only enacts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violence that in another global context would be wildly unacceptable. And what does it mean that that place is not interested in excavating or interrogating its history? What does it mean that that place is not interested or is not engaged in any sort of self-reflection about how the history of slavery continues to, as the scholar Sadia Hartman says, how the afterlife of slavery continues to shape the landscape and the infrastructure and the operations of that prison today. And that place, thinking about how the implications of that place having a gift shop, and that gift shop having shot glasses and coffee mugs and sweatshirts and T-shirts and stuffed animals dressed in prison garb. And on so many of these T-shirts and on some of these coffee mugs, they have the silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, they have written out Angola, a gated community, as if to belittle or make a mockery of the millions of people, the thousands of people who remain incarcerated there today. And, I remember this moment at the end of the chapter and at the end of my visit there. I spent my time there with a guy named Norris Henderson. And Norris is somebody who spent almost 30 years at Angola and was released maybe 2 decades ago now. And he's still very active in the prison reform movement, very active, and was part of the coalition that overturned non-unanimous sentences or 9 unanimous jury sentences a few years ago in Angola by ballot measure, or in Louisiana by ballot measure. And we were on this bus and we were going past toward the exit of the prison. And in the distance, you could see this group of men lifting their garden hose up into the air and dropping them to the ground, lifting their spades into the air and dropping them to the ground, lifting their shovels in the air and dropping them to the ground. And they were being watched by a guard on horseback. And Norris looked at his hands, and he looked at me, and he looked out the window, and he was sort of rubbing these calluses that were on his hands. And he said, "Clint, I used to be picking cotton in those fields for 7 cents an hour. And I can't tell you what it feels like to pick cotton for almost nothing on land that my ancestors very well could have been picking cotton on 150 years ago." And this has stayed with him. You know, he's been out of prison almost 20 years, but he still had the marks on his hands. He still had, and clearly had the marks in his memory. And so, you know, was really interested in exploring what Angola and the presence of Angola has to tell us about how the legacy of slavery continues to shape so much of our social, political, and economic infrastructure. Another place that I went was the Blandford Cemetery, which was one of the largest Confederate cemeteries, which is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, a place where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I went and spent the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans for Memorial Day. And as you can imagine, I was a conspicuous presence at such an event, to say the least. But it was really clarifying. It was unsettling, and it was strange, and it was in some moments frightening. But it was also incredibly clarifying to get a sense of why people believe what they believe. Because what I came to understand is that for so many people, history is not about empirical evidence. It's not about primary source documents. It's not about historical fact. It is a story that they are told, and it is a story that they tell. It is an heirloom that is passed down across generations. It is something that is grounded in family, in loyalty, a context in which, you know, loyalty takes precedence over truth. And I remember a conversation I had with a guy named Jeff, who was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And we were speaking, and he was telling me about how his grandfather used to bring him out to this cemetery. And his grandfather used to sing him these songs. And his grandfather, you know, they used to sit together in this gazebo in the middle of the cemetery, watch the deer sort of scamper through the tombstones, and watch the sun set over the trees as the sky turned pink and orange. And they would sing Old Dixie, and his grandfather would tell him these stories of all the men who were buried here and all that they fought for, and the way that their legacy has been distorted, and how brave they were. And these are people, you know, buried here who were members of the Confederate Army. And those are stories that Jeff internalized. And those are stories that Jeff continues to carry. And they shaped how Jeff understands himself in the world. And now Jeff loves, one of the things that he said he loves most is bringing his granddaughters to this land, and bringing his granddaughters to this cemetery, and telling his granddaughters some of the same stories and singing some of the same songs that his grandfather shared with him. And so it's an intergenerational project. And so the thing is, if you are to go to Jeff, and Jeff, you know, if you read the book, you'll see Jeff is like, slavery wasn't a big part of the Civil War. Like, that's not true. Even though, if you read the declarations of Confederate secession from almost any of these southern states, for example, a state like Mississippi in 1861 says, "Our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." Right? Like, they are not vague about why they're seceding from the Union. They are quite clear about it. Or you look at the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, and he says the reason for the great rupture in our country is the presence of slavery. And the Confederacy is founded on the principle that Black people, the great principle that the African and Black people are inferior to the white man. And that the goal of the institution, the goal of this new nation, is to perpetuate slavery indefinitely. It's all right there. Right? These are primary source documents. These are things that anyone can look up for themselves. But if Jeff is to accept that, if he is to accept what the primary source documents are laying out, then that would also mean that he'd have to, that it would contribute to a sort of disintegration of who he understands his grandfather to be. It would be calling into question so much of what his great grandfather told him. And in doing so, would call into question the nature of their entire relationship, because he would have to accept that so much of the thing that grounded and undergirded their relationship was grounded in a lie, grounded in mythology, grounded in falsehood. And that is difficult for people because it becomes existential, because it's a question of their identity. It's a question of how they understand themselves in the world and who they believe themselves to be. And to be sure, there are millions of people who have, like one of my friends that I went to the cemetery with, who have ancestors who fought for the Confederacy. And they make a decision. They say, I have ancestors, I have family, I'm part of a lineage of people who fought a war for a terrible, terrible thing. And yet I'm not defined by the decisions that my family made. I'm not defined by the things that my ancestors have done. I can name what they have done, say it was wrong, and then make a different set of decisions moving forward. But for many people, they feel deeply tethered to this story. They feel deeply tethered to the community. They feel deeply tethered to the lineage. They feel deeply tethered to the lie. And the lie is the sort of glue that holds everything else together. And so if they are to accept the lie as a lie, everything else would fall apart, or they believe that everything else would fall apart. And so that's why so many people, I found, hold on to it. It's not always, it is often, it is not always an outright bigotry, even though it is often sort of infused with a more subtle iteration of it. But it is very much about family and loyalty, and people not taking into consideration the collateral damage of what happens when you accept that history is true, and what implications it has for the rest of the community and country around you. The last place I'll talk about is New York City. I went to New York City in part because I wanted, for anybody who's reading my book, and this was the first time they were encountering the history of slavery, if they were using my book as an entry point, I didn't want them to leave thinking that somehow slavery was just something that existed in the South, but it was very much a national institution. And a lot of people don't realize that New York City was the second largest slave market in the country after South Carolina for an extended period of time, after Charleston, South Carolina, for a long time in the history of early America. Or that in 1861, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, actually insisted and advocated for New York City seceding from the Union alongside the southern states, because the social and political and economic infrastructure of New York City was so deeply entangled in the slaveocracy of the South. It was deeply invested in the perpetuation of slavery in ways that many particularly at that point, many members of the Democratic Party of the mid 19th century were invested in allowing to continue, because that the banks were invested in it, the insurance companies were invested in it, the textile industry was invested in it, and it was something that was profoundly relevant to their interests. And the last part is, I remember going there and not realizing that the Statue of Liberty was actually created and proposed to be given to the United States as initially as a gift to celebrate the abolition of slavery, to the point where the original version of the statue, the original design, had Lady Liberty with shackles over her arms, broken shackles, broken chain links to symbolize abolition. It was proposed by a guy named Edouard de la Boulaye, who was a great anti-slavery activist and advocate in France, and an expert on the American Constitution. And there was a lot of pushback, and ultimately they moved the chains from Lady Liberty's hands, which they replaced with a tablet and a torch, to her feet, sort of slinking subtly underneath her robe, near her toes. And you can actually only see the broken chain links under her robe if you are looking from an aerial view. If you are on Liberty Island where the statue is, you can't actually see it because the statue is so massive, and you can't, the podium upon which Lady Liberty stands doesn't allow you to see what's on her feet, which to me is this really apt metaphor about how sometimes the history of slavery is literally right next to you, sort of hidden in plain sight, in ways that we're not always cognizant of. So, these are some of the places that I visited over the course of the book. I also visited the Whitney Plantation, Galveston, Texas, Goree Island, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in New Orleans, and sort of bring all these things together to try to get a sense of what is the story that our country is telling about this history, and how can we, ultimately the thing I want people to recognize is not only our physical proximity to this history and how the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us, but also our temporal proximity, right? That I remember being taught about the history of slavery like it was something that happened in the Jurassic period, like it was the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery. But in the context of human history, this was just yesterday. Slavery existed in this country for 250 years and has only not existed for about 150. So you have an institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't. You have an institution in which the person who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter. She was the daughter in 2016 of someone born into chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 4-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't that long ago at all. And so the idea that it would have nothing to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like today is both morally and intellectually disingenuous. And I hope that what readers come away with is a sense of like, wow, this wasn't that long ago. And also the legacy, both the residue of this and the physical infrastructure that made it possible is still all around us. So I'll end there, and I look forward to taking any questions that you all have.
Thank you, Clint, for a powerful presentation and for describing to us very clearly, the power of storytelling and how it shapes our identity and also understanding of history. So we'll open it up now for questions. I invite the viewers to post questions in the comments. We also have some pre-recorded questions from our journalism students, and we would like to start with one now.
All right. Hello, my name is Layla Cox. I'm a senior double major in communications and journalism with a minor in leadership studies. My question for you is, who are some of your favorite Black writers growing up, and who are some that inspire you today?
That's an excellent question. Who are some of my favorite Black writers growing up? Oh man. I loved, as a young person, I loved Jacqueline Woodson books. And I feel so lucky, to have this life where Jacqueline Woodson is now a friend of mine. But Jackie Woodson has written so many books, starting, her career has been, 20 or 30 years now, about the life of Black and brown children in this country. And it was so powerful. I loved Walter Dean Myers' books growing up. Walter Dean Myers wrote so many young adult books for all young people, but with Black characters in a landscape, in the 90s where there weren't many of them. The 90s and the early 2000s, I think it feels now like there's a sort of a treasure trove of so many Black and brown voices in publishing, certainly relevant to what there was before. But I remember both Jacqueline Woodson and Walter Dean Myers were really important in my childhood. And today, I feel so lucky to call so many of these people friends. You have people like Hanif Abdul-Rakib, Eve Ewing, Elizabeth Acevedo, Safia El-Hilo, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Wesley Lowry, Ibram Kendi, Adam Silver. I mean, these are like my friends and colleagues and people who are just, it's hard to know because I'm in it. And like I'm surrounded by these folks, but it really feels like we're in a special moment of African American letters in terms of fiction, nonfiction, poetry. So many people doing such incredible work. And I just feel lucky to be surrounded by it. So yeah, those are a handful of my favorites and my friends.
So to continue with the theme of stories and your favorite writers, here's a question of, how have stories told by your family shaped your own identity and work?
Something that my family has always emphasized was a sense of responsibility and a sense of accountability. And part of what that emerges from is being the descendants of enslaved people. Part of what that emerges from is, this idea that, as I mentioned, slavery began, slavery in the British American colonies began in 1619 and ended in 1865. That means slavery existed in this country, approximately 250 years. What that also means is that Black people were fighting for freedom from the moment they arrived on these shores. Right? From the moment Black people showed up here, they were resisting the institution in ways large and small. What that also means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom, who fought against slavery, who fought for liberation, never had the opportunity to see it and experience it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway, because they knew that someday someone would. And I know that my existence, my ability to have this, to talk to you all, my book, my life, my children's lives are only possible because of people who fought for something they knew they might never see themselves, but they fought for it because they knew that someday someone would. And that is so remarkable to me. And it bestows upon me a profound sense of responsibility. And I think that responsibility is what animated so much of my childhood. It's like so much has been given for you to be here. What are you going to give, not only to your children or your grandchildren or the world as it exists right now, but what are you going to give to the people that you've never met? Because I think the way to think about it is like we are all chiseling away at this wall, and we don't know how thick the wall is. We don't know how long it takes to get to the light on the other side. We don't know if it's 6 inches thick or 6 miles thick. But we know that the more somebody chops away at it, the less people have to chop away at it who come behind us and who come after us. And that is what the fight for building a better world looks like. That's how I think about it. It is all of us recognizing that we are only where we are because people have chipped away at the wall before us. And so our responsibility is to keep chipping away at that wall, even when it feels like we're not getting anywhere, knowing that we are making it a little bit more possible for someone who comes after us, for people who come after us, to see the light on the other side of that sort of proverbial wall. And that's the thing that I carry. That is part of my lineage. That is part of my, family. That is what has stayed with me, and continues to stay with me. It is a humble recognition of being in this position, and also, again, a sense of accountability and responsibility. Like, all right, this is all that was done for you. So what are you going to do?
Thank you, Clint, for answering that question. To follow up with that, we have another question from a journalism student.
Hi, my name is Anibia Okan, and I'm a public relations and sports media and communication double major, and I'm a junior here at the University of Rhode Island. My question is, what will it take for the United States as a country to give up its archaic belief of being a strong nation and accept its historical flaws towards slavery and minorities as a whole?
That's the question that I'm trying to answer. I don't know that I have a specific answer, but I think that we are in a moment now. I always say that I make this joke that in 2013, 2012, if you had asked a random person, like, what is redlining? They would have been like, is that lipstick? Is that part of Rihanna's Fenty line? Like, what is redlining? What is that? And now, not all, but certainly more people recognize it as a mechanism through which housing segregation was perpetuated throughout the course of the 20th century. And so, I think we are collectively developing a more robust framework, vocabulary, lexicon, language, and understanding of the way that a history of racism and white supremacy has shaped the American landscape. And understanding that racism is not just an interpersonal phenomenon, but also a structural one, and a systemic one, and a historical one. And so we are certainly in a different place than we were before. I mean, you can look at it in the last Democratic primary and the way that every single person was saying that they supported putting up a bill to study reparations in ways that would have been unimaginable years ago. And that's not to say that that's enough. That's not to say that that is all fine and good by itself. But I think it would do a disservice to so many people who have fought for so long to say that that doesn't matter. There has been a shift in our public consciousness. And there's also been a backlash. And we see that in the context of the critical race theory battles. I put the critical race theory in air quotes because it's not actually a battle about critical race theory. That's just the name that they're using as the sort of boogeyman in an attempt to scare so many people and scare so many teachers from teaching this subject matter. But what I think it requires is the work that so many people are doing today, being honest, being forthright, and being clear about how we cannot understand how one community looks one way and another community looks another way, without understanding that it is not because of the people in those communities, but it is because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And that our contemporary landscape of inequality is the result of a series of policy decisions and not cultural pathologies, because that was the sort of pervading thought throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And we are only now, I think, in a broader way, moving toward a more robust and honest understanding of where we come from.
Thank you. There are some really good comments in the comment section. I invite the viewers to also ask questions as well, and we'll pick some and post them live for Clint to answer. To continue with this conversation, back to the book, we have the next question. What was the biggest takeaway for you from the experiences you were exposed to that shaped the writing of this book?
I mean, I was struck by, and this will come as no surprise, but like the US is such a heterogeneous place, and there are so many there's such a profound difference in the way that people understand the history of this country. And, part of what I tried to capture in the book is the sort of heterogeneity of the collective memory of this country, where you have places like Angola and the Blanford Cemetery on one end of the spectrum, and you have places like the Whitney Plantation and the community in Galveston, Texas, celebrating Juneteenth on the other end of the spectrum. And we are really operating, and we know this in a media context, you have like MSNBC and Fox News, or, all the different iterations of media, of the media ecosystem. But we really are operating in like fundamentally different epistemological realities in a huge way. Like people have really different sets of knowledge that they pull from. And that makes creating a collective understanding of anything incredibly difficult. And I saw, the United States we have so many regions and so many communities and so many places with their own cultural and social idiosyncrasies and histories. that it can be hard to get everybody on the same page. And part of it, unlike some European countries, we don't have a national curriculum. So, you go to France and there's like a national curriculum and there's a set of expectations about what everybody's going to learn. We don't have that here, right? Like what students learn is largely dependent on individual school districts, individual schools, individual teachers within those individual schools, in ways that are not the case for a lot of other places. So it's harder to establish a collective sense of anything. And that was only made clearer during my trips to these places.
Thank you. To continue with the discussion about the book and the writing process, we have a question from the audience. I think it is so important to be looking at a place in relation to stories and to the enslavement of humans. Can you talk more about what motivated you to write this book in this way?
I wanted to write a history book that felt like a novel. I wanted to write a history book that felt like a historical piece of writing, but also a literary one. And so as much as it is, in conversation with so many of the books, by historians that I love, it is also pulling from a range of different genres. It's pulling from novels. It's pulling from plays. Like I'm really interested in this idea of playwrights who break the fourth wall. Like there would be some moments where I sort of turn to the reader and start using the second person and say you, and address the sort of you who is reading the book in ways that are not necessarily consistent with how it is throughout. But I think those moments can be powerful. I learned that from plays that I've read. For the novelists and the poets, what poetry has done more than anything, it has taught me to pay attention. It has taught me that no detail is too small. And so, I wanted to capture the sensory details of a place. I wanted to capture the scenes of a place. I wanted it to feel cinematic. I wanted the reader to feel like they were standing right there. And so that means I had to capture the sights and the smells and the feeling of a place with sensory details and sort of texture that I might not have written, that you might not encounter in a lot of traditional nonfiction. It also means that in order to, make it feel novelistic, almost like I'm the protagonist of this journey that you are accompanying me on, I had to reveal some level of interiority as the writer. You all are journalists. There's a school of journalists and emerging journalists, a school of communication. Writers and journalists make different sets of decisions based on the project and based on the context of how much of themselves they are willing to reveal. I studied a lot of the sort of history of new journalism a few decades ago, where people were beginning to insert themselves more directly into the stories, and reveal and not operate. For me, it felt important not to operate under any pretense of objectivity or neutrality, but to say I'm deeply invested in this story. I'm deeply invested in this work, and I think that proximity is helpful. I think that proximity is a gift. I don't think it prevents me, as has been sort of disingenuously used against Black writers and academics for many, many centuries. I don't think that prevents me from doing this work. I think it, amplifies my ability to do it.
Thank you. And I'm going to actually follow up with a question for the benefit of my students. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of researching and writing a book like this?
Yeah, so just logistically, so the way it worked was that I would go to a place. I would try to, at first, honestly, at first I went to a place and I thought I'll go to these places and I'll write my reflections of like the tour that I went on. And I realized that was too narrow. Like if I was going to tell a story about how slavery is remembered throughout this country, I had to tell a story that included more voices than my own. And so then I put on my journalist hat, even though I wasn't a journalist at this point. It's interesting because so much of the narrative around this book is like poet and journalist Clint Smith goes to XYZ. But as I was writing this, I was a graduate student in sociology of education. And I had done some freelancing, but I did not think of myself as a journalist. But obviously now looking back, what I was doing was journalism. I was walking up to people and asking them questions, and just like, and that was very new to me, and it was very scary to me. Like, I'm not an extrovert in that, like, it's not an easy thing to do to like go up to random people at a plantation and ask, like, how do you experience the, what this place means, and put it in conversation with the trauma of this history. So it took a lot. I probably wouldn't have gone to spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans if, like, the journalistic sensibilities weren't sort of like firing inside of me and being like, you have to go. Like, Clint, the person, like, as an individual, is not inclined to go spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Clint, the journalist, is like, this is a story that I have to capture. And I'm really happy about that, because it puts me in places that I otherwise wouldn't go. And I end up learning things that I otherwise wouldn't learn. So what I love about being a journalist is that it pulls me out of my comfort zone in ways that I can't always anticipate. So I would go to these places. I try to talk to as many people as possible. I would take a lot of pictures. I would take a lot of video. And then I'd go home and I would get the interviews transcribed, or transcribe them myself, depending on the length. And then I would also, but before that, I would try to write down as much as I could about, like, what it, just again, those sensory details, what it looked like, smelled like, felt like. So I'm like scribbling notes, I'm typing away. I'm taking a lot of notes while I'm there. And I come back and I start typing, and while the scene feels fresh. And then afterwards, then I take the transcription and I start putting the transcription in places where it is relevant relative to, like, this sort of chronology of the scenes that I'm exploring. And then I look at it and I have a better sense. I actually do I do some general background research on a place before I go, but I do most of my research after, because I don't know until afterwards what specific things I'll need to address in the context of the book. So, after I left Monticello is when I read Annette Gordon Reed's The Hemings of the Monticello, or read several biographies of Thomas Jefferson, or read Lucia Stanton's biography of the enslaved at Monticello, and all these things, because I didn't really know what I was looking for. And then sometimes you go back because you're like, oh, well, I actually have a few more things I need to answer. So yeah, it was, and so I did it almost as if each one was a different essay, a sort of self-contained thing, and that made it feel more manageable. I would do one place, finish that, and then go to another place, finish that, and go to another place, and it made it feel much like I could accomplish it much more in a way that felt more possible and tangible.
Thank you for explaining that. We actually have another question from a journalism student coming up next.
Hello, my name is Imani, and I'm a third-year student studying journalism and political science. My question is, first and foremost, I think it is so amazing that you are not only an author, but you are a teacher and a poet as well. And I'm just wondering how you decide which medium will be most effective in conveying your message. Perfect, you're all set.
I just am kind of governed by my curiosities. The writers and thinkers I admire most are people who, they wrote poems, they wrote plays, and they wrote novels, and they wrote academic articles, and they wrote, I think of Du Bois, I think of Zora Neale Hurston, I think of Langston Hughes, I think of, so many who rejected Baldwin, who rejected the compartmentalization of genre, and who said that the story they are trying to tell, or the genre they use, will depend on the story they're trying to tell. So, my first book was a book of poetry. My second book is a book of narrative nonfiction. I would love to, write a novel. I'd love to write some plays. I just love exploring all these different spaces. And I think there's a lot that can be done in each of them. I love exploring different types of media and medium. Like, I have a series I'm doing right now that was mentioned at the beginning with Crash Course. And it's a sort of series of 10 to 15 minute YouTube videos on different parts of Black American history. We're doing 50 episodes of it. And I like that because I can maybe reach different people in that space than I would with a book. And that's okay. I think people learn in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, I'm always kind of just like interested in trying new things and thinking about the different ways that people learn, the different ways that people consume art, because I similarly, love to learn and consume art and literature in a range of different ways.
Thank you, Clint. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we have one last question from the audience. It's sorry. We are going to end with this question because we're almost out of time. So to tie back our conversation to what we started with and the focus of your book, could you say more about prisons as part of the afterlife of slavery?
Yeah, so that's a term used by the scholar Saidiya Hartman, who's a historian, a writer, a scholar of literature as well. And part of what she talks about is this idea that, so for example, when I'm at Angola, I would not say, and I know there are other people who would say differently, but I would not say that Angola or prison is the same as slavery. Because there are real phenomenological differences between the two. And I don't think that we have to say that one is the other in order to illuminate the horror of one of them. So, a very clear difference is that in slavery, you are born into, like if your mother was enslaved, you are then by definition enslaved, like through partis sequitur ventrem, which was created in Virginia, in colonial Virginia, which said that the status of the child will come from the mother, which was created in part to allow white enslavers to have sex with their enslaved Black property, and to then allow those children, their children, to be enslaved. And so part of it is a recognition that like that is not what happens in prison. Obviously, a lot of sociologists have talked about the relationship, you're more likely to end up in prison if you have incarcerated parents. But because your parents are incarcerated, it does not inherently mean that you will be incarcerated, which is different than slavery, in which you are going to be an enslaved person if your mother is enslaved. So that in and of itself is a real difference that deserves distinction and precision. And I think that part of why I think talking about prisons as the afterlife of slavery is that we don't have to say it is slavery, but we can say it is undoubtedly shaped and animated by the history of that institution in ways that we see in profound ways, as I described, all around us. So yeah, I think the afterlife of slavery allows us to say, both in the context of prison, but elsewhere, that the legacy of slavery shapes our political, economic, and social infrastructure in profound ways and continues to do so.
Thank you, Clint. We're almost out of time, so I would like to thank Clint again for joining us today and for the wonderful conversation and for answering our questions. People in the audience, we have a Zoom link if you're interested in continue this conversation after the end of this session. Dr. Catherine John will be moderating that, so please check out the link in the comment section. We also have a link to the book if you would like to purchase one. And now I would like to turn over to Dean Wiley, who is going to help us end the session.
Good evening, everyone, and my thanks to Clint for joining us this evening to converse with us about his book, How the Word is Passed. We were fortunate to have him join us. Even though it was virtual, I can tell from the comments that were going on that people were engaged, and I know that our students took a great deal away from this. I hope you all will join us again at the next Harrington School virtual event, the Amirpour Lecture on November 10th, featuring Abby Phillips, CNN's anchor and senior political correspondent, who will discuss honesty and authenticity in political journalism with us. Events like these, this discussion with Clint Smith, the upcoming Amirpour Lecture, happen due to our URI alumni and friends who so generously contribute to our Harrington Rhody Now Fund. We welcome your support. You can be part of ensuring engaged, thought-provoking programming continues for our students, for our alumni, the Rhode Island community, and beyond. And again, thank you. For those of you who wish to continue the conversation, please join Professor Catherine John in the breakout room. and have a great evening.